Welcome everybody yet again. Good afternoon. Welcome to this another Belfast Summer School lecture. And today I am thrilled, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Philip Burton from the University of Birmingham. So a little bit about Philip. His PhD is from Cambridge. He is a reader in Latin and early Christian studies at the University of Birmingham. His specialisms include the relationship between early Christianity and the wider world of Greco-Roman literature and thought. And Philip has published on language in the Confessions of Augustine and, very interesting, crypto-Celts and crypto-Romans in the Legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien. And Philip also has been teaching Greek and Latin for me, so I'm extra excited to have him here to talk to us. So I will hand over to you, Philip.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Helen, and it's lovely to see you all here. I always enjoy Helen McVeigh Academy events, absolutely always. So great to see some old friends there and many new faces too. I'm going to start with an apology here, or rather a disclaimer. I'm going to quote from various languages other than English or Latin from time to time. This does not mean I necessarily know those languages, it just means I bluff my way in them. This is partly because I've been struck, certainly in the classes I've run for Helen, just what a range of backgrounds people have, linguistically as well as in other ways, coming here. And I find people always react well when we talk about Latin and other languages related to it, etymologies, derivations, changes. People seem to be fascinated with these. So, I hope you'll forgive me if I bluff a little bit there. A bit about the format of what I'm going to say. Rather like Gore, it's divided into three parts. There's an interesting part, I hope, at the beginning, where I talk us through a little bit of Latin, which is probably meant to represent something like popular speech. Then a less interesting bit in the middle where I go through some sort of technical details of the sort of developments we get between Latin and Romance languages, popular spoken Latin, and how this all plays out in Romance. And then hopefully another slightly more interesting bit at the end where we look at another example of a real Latin text and try and unpick some of the features of the spoken language that we find in it. I do hope as we go through people will feel able to speak up and ask questions, maybe particularly in the last bit. So if we're all happy then, without further ado, I shall share a document which I think was circulated earlier, but I think it might be easier if we share screen on this. Can you all see this document which begins with the words Petronius Satyricon 42? Is that visible? Lovely, thank you. Okay, well, I put this one up because if you've had dealings with Petronius Satyricon before, this is in large part an attempt to convey the speech of more or less educated, more or less free people from the early Roman imperial period, so mid-1st century AD. This is from the famous section known as Trimalchio's Banquet, which isn't a title that we'll find in the original, but there you go. This is one of the freedman characters at this party organised by this freedman Trimalchio, describing his situation there. And I give you a translation and I give you the Latin text underneath. I'm not going to go through the translation, it's all numbered, so I hope you can see how it's gone through there. But I put a few words in bold and I want to talk about these and ways in which they might relate to other things we'll be talking about today. So there in that first sentence, fui enim hodie in funus. Today I went to a funeral. You might think, well, that's the most ordinary piece of Latin imaginable. A few things I'm going to flag up though. In funus there, if you're taught, when you're taught Latin, you learn early on in with the accusative case means towards. I was today towards a funeral. Sounds slightly odd. Well, maybe something's happening in the case system there. We'll come back to that later. Fui, I was at a funeral, or I went to a funeral. Again, we might translate it either way. If we translate it as I went to a funeral, that makes more sense of our infulness that we have at the end, but it's a rather funny use of the verb fui, meaning to go. I'm going to start bluffing here. Spanish ir, preterite fui, could be a similar sort of phenomenon there. And then we have this reference to this lovely guy, homo bellus there. And again, this is not an adjective that you'll learn in Latin to GCSE. Good, marvellous, nice, originally a diminutive of bonellus. And we see it in earlier Latin, in Roman commentary in particular. And it's a word, of course, that's very familiar from a lot of the Romance languages, beau, bello, and so on and so forth. And here it is occurring in this representation of popular speech. Appellawit, he called. Again, familiar sort of classical verb. Come back to that later, because verbs to call are ones which are subject to change. Going through a little bit more. For 5 days, this is in section 8, quinque dies aquam in ossuum non coniecit. Going to flag this up partly because it's a non-change, if you like. The word for mouth is something that does change in later Latin. We'll come on to that again as well. But here we see a non-change, and non-changes are just as interesting in their way. Number 10 there, sentence 10. Medici illum perdiderunt. The doctors did for him. And if you look through a lot of this this passage, and through Petronius generally, you'll find that these demonstrative pronouns, ille, that one over there, they tend to occur a little bit more frequently than one might expect compared to forms of is, ea, id. And we've seen a few examples already. Sentence 4, virio mihi cum illo loqui. I think I'm talking with him. You could have cum eo, cum illo there. They did for him. A little bit further on, but it was a bad fate, a malus fatus, well, of course, we'd expect malum fatum in classical Latin, evil fate. Here we've got a masculine cropping up instead of a neuter. What do we make of that? Come back to that as well later. And then later on, he was properly wailed away. This was number 12 at his funeral. Planctus est optime. Etiam si maligne illum again. Even if his wife didn't weep for him, she shed crocodile tears. She didn't weep in good faith. Ploravit, to cry. Again, there's changes in this area in the Latin language. One of the standard classical Latin verbs is fleo, which you very often get in compounds, of course, de fleo, cum fleo, etc. Ploravit, we might think that's a little bit more like things you see in French, pleurer, or llorar in Spanish. And ux was another non-change word. We have it in Latin, we don't actually have it in Romance. So various features there which look either classical or non-classical according as you take it. And then this rather nice sort of double negative at the end. Nehinem nihil boni facere oportet. No one should do nothing good for anyone there. Double negatives, common at all periods of the spoken language, but again, nice to see it in there. Now, the Satyricon, I think, I have slightly uneasy feelings about this actually, because I always feel here we've got a posh person, Petronius, sneering at people who don't speak Latin just quite as poshly as himself. If you want to know the Latin expression for speaking good, proper Latin, it's just latine loqui, speaking Latin. And these characters here, these freedmen characters, they're getting it wrong time and time again. If they have the option of saying something which is slightly subliterary, they will go straight for it. So even early on, we see here variety in different levels of Latin, as we would expect, and we see some changes which we later find in the language. So having said that much by way of preface. I want to move into the second part of what I'm saying. I'm going to stop sharing and start sharing again, where we go through in slightly more formal terms some of the processes that we have happening in popular Latin. So stop sharing there and start sharing. I'm sorry, I'm out of practice with Zoom. We need another pandemic, don't we, really? How's it gone now? Share. No, I'm probably not sharing what I want to share. I'm sorry, bear with me a second. Start sharing. That's looking better. Good. Set of slides here. I'll just scroll up to the top and we'll get underway. Okay, what I want to talk about is the sound system of classical Latin and some developments we see in it. What happens to the noun system, to the verb system, and last of all to the vocabulary. And this is a very partial coverage. It's not full and systematic. It's really as much popular Latin linguistics as I can cram into the time available. I want to start off with a diagram, which many of you may have seen versions of before. The vowel system of Latin. Classical Latin, as we know, has got 10 basic vowels, A, E, I, O, U, each in their long and short variants there. And these are conventionally arranged on this sort of parallelogram here. Usually we'd see it with a slightly longer front axis towards the left here. This represents the front of the mouth. The higher up you are, the higher up in your mouth, and the lower the lower. So E is a high front vowel, R is a low back vowel on this system. This is a conventional way of diagrammatizing it. We move on here. Just want to just giving you this. It's my one and only illustration for today, and I apologize for the general absence of illustrations, but this is from the tombs of the Scipios. It's actually a reproduction of it, but this contains an interesting early Latin inscription, which I shall come on to. Still experimenting with this. Let's try that. Yes, here's part of the inscription on it. And this is an early Latin, and it's not especially popular Latin, although Latin's not really systematized at this date. It's not really systematized in the 3rd century BC in the way we expect it to be later on. But what I really want to show off here is the first sentence. Hunc oino plurime consentiunt Romae duonorum optimum fuisse virum. Okay, this one man, all at Rome agree, of all good men, to have been the best. And if you look at a lot of these words here, oino, there you'd expect to see unum in classical Latin with the um at the end. Duonorum, that's bonorum in classical Latin. Optimo, that's optimum. And viro there, virum in classical Latin. And what this tells us here is that the pronunciation of the final M's for this particular, whoever wrote this, is extremely weak. We do have it cropping up there in Lucian, gets it right there, but then drops it again for Scipione there. So already evidence of a pronunciation which isn't the familiar one that we have in classical Latin. And of course, if you think of things like Latin verse, you regularly get the M syllables ending in an M elided when they're followed by a vowel, which suggests a very weak sort of pronunciation. Vowel length here. Yeah, this is one of the big differences between classical Latin and later and spoken Latin. We've got these 10 basic vowels in classical Latin, and this system is already being eroded by the 1st century AD. Give you a simple example there from Martial, a line of his epigrams. Even if a mighty auction were to take place on the heights of Olympus, Altio there, and the scansion there, short O at the end, which you wouldn't find in Latin written a century earlier than that. So some sort of weakening of the distinction already taking place. We really see this big time in a poet called Commodian, and I'd be surprised and delighted if anyone had heard or read any Commodian before, but he's a Christian Latin poet, quite possibly the earliest Christian Latin poet we know of. We don't know his date, unfortunately. Mid-3rd century, so around 250, is a favourite sort of guess, but it's a bit of a guess. One of the interesting things about his poem is he has absolutely minimal idea how to write classical Latin properly. I won't go through the details of the different ways in which he gets it wrong, but he understands it's something to do with the stress patterns on words. He understands it's something to do with the length of different vowels, but he regularly gets all these wrong. If you were to try scanning this as a classical Latin hexameter, you would not get very far, even though that's clearly what he's trying to do. And there are hundreds of lines like this, so clearly he does not know what's going on here. And Augustine, I mentioned before, writing, this is around AD 400, he actually refers to the fact that his African audience can't distinguish between long and short vowels. So possibly 150 years later, and he's talking about Africans here. I suspect, however, it's much more general by this stage. He's being a little bit deprecating about his own audience. You know, I do this sort of thing for my congregation in Hippo in North Africa. But there we have it. We have explicit evidence that the word for bones, os rather, with a short O, and mouth, os, are pretty much indistinguishable by this date. So there we go. That's going to be a major change that we have. We mentioned the weak pronunciation of final M. We come on to that again briefly here. Also, final S is weakly pronounced in certainly in earlier Latin. Again, we have some evidence of this from Latin meter. If you look at, I give you a quotation from Lucretius there, and this line ending omnibus rebus. And again, if you've done your classical Latin scansion, you'll know that you could not, Virgil would never end a line omnibus rebus. But Lucretius feels able to do it, and so do earlier Roman poets. And in fact, Cicero tells us on this that this was the posh pronunciation in the past. It was a politeus, it was slicker. But he now says it's subrusticum, it's rather sort of rural. So there we go, we have another sort of bit of variation in the language. What is old-fashioned, what's posh, what's subliterary is an interesting and vague area. I'm just going to give you the example of a word like twas in English. If you see apostrophe T, W-A-S in English, that's almost always a literary sort of feature, isn't it? But actually it's the sort of thing we could also say in everyday speech without even noticing what we're doing, I think. One of the big changes we have in the Latin vowel system is what's called the loss of the paratonic vowel, the vowel which stands nearest to the stressed vowel in the word. We get a lot of this. So for instance, a handful of words in Latin, we regularly see alternation. So saeculum, we learn meaning age or century or generation. In poetry, we often see it as cyclum. I'll give you an example from Virgil here. Periculum, we often see as periculum. And some words it's become regularized. So the name Paulus, which is from Parvulus, the adverb valde, meaning very, very much, originally from valide, strongly, and valde is simply the standard form. And again, we'll see a lot of this sort of thing. At this point, I need to rearrange this on my screen so I can move down a slide. That'll work. Okay. So some common changes that we see in often in later Latin and certainly in the Romance languages. Long E and short I largely fall together as an E pronunciation. So Latin words for pear tree and true Pirus and Veros. Italian shows this probably most clearly, Piero and Vero rather, pure rhymes. Short E, and I fall together as and again, non-rhyming words in Latin, veto, I forbid, and caecus, blind, gives you very similar words in Italian, vieto and cieco. Long O, short U, again, fall together. This is simply the parallel on the back axis of what you have on the front axis with a long E and short I. So Latin normen, name, and nucem, nut, Italian norme and norce there. And the loss of the paratonic vowel, we just talked about that a moment ago. One thing I should mention here, some of you might have come across the phrase the La Spezia Rimini line in Romance linguistics, one of these famous dividing lines in the Romance languages. Essentially, to the north and west of this line, which goes across sort of central northern Italy, where you have certain sorts of consonants between vowels, they are voiced, so you have vibration of your vocal cords put in. So Latin focus, meaning fire, gives you a f, fuego in Spanish, but fuoco and foc in Italian and Romanian respectively. It's very hard to identify this for Latin. It's a much more sporadic sort of phenomenon there. And this is rather like the way American English typically voices forms like latter to ladder. Okay, it's not regular in Latin. We have occasional examples of it. What we do see a lot of in Latin, and we've seen some of it actually already in Petronius, is the remodeling of the declension system. Nobody at school learning French or Latin or Italian or Spanish, or no, Latin out of it, learning a modern language starts by learning declensions, okay? And that's largely because the classical system has effectively broken down. The first and second declension stay pretty much what they were, some exceptions in a moment. Fourth declension is basically assimilated to the second declension. Think of words like domus in Latin, plural, genitive plural domorum, accusative plural domos. It's already partly assimilated to the second, and this becomes absolutely widespread. Fifth declension is largely assimilated to the first, and again we have sort of examples of this in Latin. Consider your word for timber. Marteries or materia, both are actually used in Latin. And later on we have things like species in appearance going to specia, glacies going to glacia or glacio, and so on and so forth. The third declension is always the messy one. It's still partly there, but it's often been regularized in various ways, because probably we will remember that if you got through the first and second declensions, they seem pretty easy. Third declension is where it gets difficult. A lot of nouns, especially what's called the I-stem nouns, these are the ones with the genitive plural in IUM, they often get remodeled on the basis of diminutives. I'll give you a whole set of examples there. So apis, the B word, apicula, gives us forms like abeja in Spanish and abeille in French. Ovis, sheep, ovicula, similar sorts of developments there. The bucket word, citis, well, what we have in French, le seau, Italian secchio, based on cyclus, the diminutive form there. The ear word, of course, another one. The lentil word, interestingly enough, English word lentil comes from a diminutive. And the bird word, aves, diminutives avicula or avicella or avicellus there. I should say aviculus or avicellus, in fact, should be masculine. Oiseau, uccello, and so on and so forth. So a lot of regularizing going on there. The Romans find their declension system difficult to take away there. Neuter. We noticed in Petronius, malus fatus here. And what we have here is often a remodeling of neuters as masculine. So pondus and tempus gives us forms like pondo and tempo and so on and so forth. A lot of these are actually lost. The words for wound, gift, liver, journey. These so-called imparasyllabics, these are the ones where you have more syllables in non-nominative forms. So oneness, oneris, yekur, yekunaris, etc. Italian sometimes, and regularly, Romanian fairly regularly, preserves a handful of neuters. Handful in Italian, and these will be familiar if you've had dealings with Italian before. So the knee word, genu in Latin, you have the diminutive, geniculus, or geniculum, gives you ginocchio, with the plural ginocchia, uovo, egg, plural uova, so still looking a little bit like classical Latin. But there's a fairly defined set of them. I'm not claiming that's the whole lot. Those are, I think, the common ones in Italian. And Romanian, there's a whole lot more of them. There's the egg word, u, plural ua. Just check we didn't lose something there. Yeah. So think of how our sound changes are going to affect the declension there. I think I might need to move this slide if I can. I'm not sure if I can. It seems a bit set in its ways. I'm going to stop sharing and restart sharing just to see if I can get that looking slightly better. Let's see if that improves matters at all. Okay, share alike. Share. And we should be able to see it there. That hasn't really improved matters as much as I would have hoped. But that's slightly better. Okay, imagine this as being a set of Latin forms from around AD 400. Okay, after certain sound changes have taken place. And you'll see if you look at this set of examples I give you, that a number of different forms has reduced dramatically. So for instance, your accusative is no longer servum, it's gone to servo, with sort of nasalization at the end, and then just to servo. And then we have similar things in the dative and the ablative, so a whole breakdown of the system there in different ways. Less marked maybe in the plural, but still there nonetheless. So you have fewer different forms in circulation. And this leads us to a sort of cyclic process, I think. Essentially, we have the erosion of case endings, meaning we need other things to rely on other things to convey grammatical information. Prepositions are a classic one of these. Word order is another. But then once we have things like the use of prepositions doing the function of cases, for instance, add plus the accusative instead of using the dative for talking to someone, this in turn makes the case endings increasingly irrelevant. And going back to Augustine again, we have explicit evidence from him, from around 400, for this form inter hominibus being used rather than inter homines. Someone being a little bit too concerned to get their Latin right, and they're using this ibus ending, which I think is probably not necessarily a feature of spoken language by this stage, overcorrecting, overcompensating for it. So if something like that's happening to the verbs, what's happening to the nouns rather? What's happening to the verbs? Our first conjugation is fairly stable, and our fourth is also fairly stable, and our second to some extent too. The real problem is the third conjugation. Again, it's the horrible one when you're learning Latin, one everyone hates. It overlaps a lot with the second and fourth. You often get verbs with mixed conjugations. So video, for instance, is a second conjugation verb, as we all know, but it's got a perfect weedy, not widowy, which we might expect. And the same thing with wenio, got the perfect weni, which looks third conjugation, not weniwi, which again we might expect. And in fact, we have quite a lot of variation between the third and the second and the fourth in classical Latin. So again, Virgil, no less a writer, uses fervere rather, to boil, to be all above, as a third conjugation verb. And Servius, a commentator, actually notes this. Partly this is due to the erosion of vowel lengths, and partly the desire to use regular forms rather than irregular forms. Again, if we look at the Romance languages, we'll see the third conjugation is very largely eroded. So, for instance, verb like capere or recipere, the compound. You look at French, you've got recevoir, Spanish recibir, and Italian capire there. Sometimes it goes the other way, so one or two verbs move to the third in Italian, but not many. There is this tendency to regularize verbs, especially ones with unusual perfects. Okay, so think of the reduplicating perfects in particular, things like cano, perfect kekini, often replaced by canto, this intensive form. Pello, perfect pepuli, often replaced by pulso. So you have forms like pousser in French, empujar in Spanish, bussare in Italian, and similar things with the verb yakio, to throw. Yaki, it's not duplicating, but it's still a bit irregular. Tango, perfect tetigi, rather nice this, I rather like this. It's replaced by this sort of baby talk word toko there. And a lot of these verbs as well have a new past participle created. Of course, we have to learn past participles when we learn Latin verbs because they're not predictable. So we have this new one, ultus, coming along. So on some Latin verbs, this is regular, so solutus, statutus, but a lot of ones it isn't. And if you look at the Romance languages, we have forms like venu, venuto, vu, veduto, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing about this is it must be quite early. The province of Dacia is lost to the Roman Empire in the mid-3rd century, but we still see this in Romanian, forms like avut from the directly cognate Italian avuto, French u there. So this must be happening very early on, even though we're not actually seeing it in our sources at all. Let's move swiftly onwards. Two verbs in particular do weird things. The verb to go, ire, from the 1st century AD, the monosyllabic forms of this verb get replaced by forms from vado, to go. It's called suppletion. And if you think of French or Italian forms of the verb to go, you will see that we have something similar happening there. Not quite the same as what we have in Latin, but a process which is starting to occur. Esse, if we look at pretty much all our Latin texts, this is very stable, even though it's a very irregular verb. If we look at the Romance languages, you can see people are regularizing it in various ways. So your French infinitive être is from a form essere, which is in fact exactly what you find in Italian as well. We often find the verb sedeo, to sit, and sta and sto, to stand, being used to take many of its forms. So ser in Spanish, of course, to be. We can't really find direct evidence for this in Latin. I've tried, and you can find some things which look vaguely like it, but, well, actually quite like it, but they're occasional, they're sporadic. This example from Seneca, for instance. Terrarum gravissimum pondus sediat immortem, that the world should abide unmoved. It sort of means to be, but really not quite. And stare, likewise, to give you an example from Virgil, stat feriaciesum crone corusco stricta. There, the iron sword stands drawn. It's not literally standing up. It's a little bit like what we have in Romance languages with a past participle there, but it's kind of on the cusp. And there's a methodological sort of issue here as well. It's a bit problematic reading Latin as if it were Romance. I have some issues with that. Nearly there now. Verbal forms. We have a periphrastic perfect in the Romance languages, of course, j'ai vu, and so on and so forth. Certainly in spoken languages, and certainly in Spanish and sorry, in French and Italian, not so much in Spanish. And again, we have some examples of this early on in Latin there, slightly subliterary there. Bellum Hispaniense, 1st century BC text, preserved with the works of Caesar. Caesar had set up a fort, Castellum habuit constitutum there. It looks rather like a Roman-style construction to bring something into a particular state. But again, it's not something we see regularly and grammatically. The future as well. Think of the future tense in Latin verbs, whether it's the bo, bis, bit endings or the am, is, es endings. You won't see these in the Romance languages. Instead, you've got this construction involving the present infinitive and the verb to have. And again, we can see sort of examples of this in classical Latin. So here's one from Cicero, De Natura Deorum, 46 BC. Quoting the famous Greek agnostic Protagoras, he says, concerning the gods, I shall not say whether they exist or do not exist. Non habeo dicere, I don't have to say, I shall not say. And here we have the Greek as well, and you can see it's exactly the same construction, or very similar at least, echo edenai there. So maybe Cicero is thinking of the Greek there. But we do, if we go all the way forward in time to the 7th century, have a document where absolutely we can see this happening. This is to do with the Emperor Justinian conquering the Emperor of Persia and asking him to hand over the various cities and provinces that back to the Roman state. And he refuses to do so. He says, non dabo, I shan't give them. And Justinian says, Daras, which is both the name of the city of Daras, and presumably also it's the pronunciation of you will give, dare habebis, or dare habes, reduced to Daras at the end there. It's often said to be the first example we have of this. Lexicon, nearly there now. I've given you a long list of casualties. Words that we regularly see in classical Latin and typically don't see in the Romance languages. If you want to check these out, I've put on a bibliography, the famous Romance etymological word book by Wilhelm Meyer-Jübke, which you can access online. It's in German, but that doesn't matter because the format's extremely usable. You can check these out, but a lot of words just vanish. Manius, for instance, goes. We have grandis, which again we actually saw back in Petronius there. The word for the word to know in the Western Romance languages as well. We have only forms from sapio, not from scio. The word for city, urbs, vanishes within classical Latin. We very seldom see it in written later Latin. The word for word, on the other hand, we see all the time in written texts, but we have nowhere in the Romance languages. You've got this Greek word meaning parable, comparison, oddly enough. And we could go through all the other items in this list, and they're all interesting and odd in different ways. One particularly interesting phenomenon is the way that a lot of the words we see in the Romance languages are ones which we find in early Latin and then which are sort of submerged. Okay, they go underground, they become subliterary. So the verb to chat, we see a lot in Roman comedy, fabulari, hablar in Spanish, falar in Portuguese, but not very common in classical Latin. Porto is much more common than ferro. Ferro is obviously an educated verb. Equile, that should be rather than equiste, are a word meaning that over there, which you see in Plautus and Terence, but you don't see elsewhere. Manduco and buca, to eat and a mouthful or mouth. Well, we have this lovely example from Suetonius, his Life of Augustus, where Augustus, we have a little quotation from the way he actually talks, and he says, I swallowed 2 mouthfuls, duas bucas manducavi, where again, these are verbs that you see in, words you see in the Romance languages, bouche, manger, rather than ones you expect in classical Latin. Sometimes it's said we have slang words taking over. I'm a bit unhappy about the definition of the word slang, but there's some convincing examples, I think. Our head word, pot, testa, in Latin. The word for horse, equus, vanishes. We have caballus, meaning something like nag, any old horse. Strangely, German has got the word veredus derived from Latin, which, although Latin or Romance languages tend not to. Bellus we've talked about there. And lastly, a handful of Greek words which really gain a footing in the language. Platea gives you place, a square, an open, wide space. A word for uncle, theos, certainly in Spanish and Italian. The verb to speak across large parts of the Romance world, parabolare. The word for stone, even interesting enough, the word for calm, which is all scrambled up in Romance. Come on to that maybe another day. So odd sets of words coming in from all different angles there. Now, I promised a bibliography, and there is a brief bibliography here, which I'm happy to circulate. I've tried to put on here things which are accessible online or buyable for fairly moderate sums of money. I had to put Jim Adams' Anthology of Informal Latin there because that's a really good place to go if you want to go into this in any way. Adams, sadly no longer with us, was simply the world's authority on this subject. How are we doing for time? Have I got 5 minutes? Yes?
Yes, we're okay, yep.
Marvellous. I can't actually, I just about see my time. Good. Okay, let's go back and share again the other document, which was did I get the right one? Yes, you can see the bibliography again there. Oh, hang on, no, that's the wrong one. Let's get rid of that and get the right one. This one. Can you see there the Petronius we saw earlier? Yeah. Okay, let's scroll down a little bit. And I'm going to go to a document from the 380s. And this is an account of a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Pilgrimage is something which takes off in the 4th century AD after the Christianization of the Roman Empire under Constantine and his successors. And this is a document by a nun, possibly Spanish, whom we call Egeria, written probably in the 380s. She's literate, but she's not trying to write literary Latin, and that's quite revealing. So if we look at this first account that she gives, meanwhile walking, we came to a place where the mountains we were travelling between open out and make an immense valley, huge, absolutely flat, very lovely. Say Aperiebant Montes, the mountains were opening up. Didn't talk about this, but of course the classical Latin passive forms disappear altogether in Romance, but not in Latin at all. Latin writers continue using them. So if you know how to write Latin, you've, by definition, learned how to use these. And just occasionally we see things slipping in which look more like the popular language there. Say Aperiebant, they opened out. And they made a valley which was immense, infinitam, ingens, planissimae, while they pulchram. Okay, well, she's all at sea here. While infinitam is absolutely fine, but then ingens should be ingentium, shouldn't it? What's going on here? Well, it's these pesky imparasyllabics yet again. She probably knows that ingens can, in certain circumstances, be an accusative form. It could be neuter accusative. So she's putting it in here just to be on the safe side. You know, that's usually not what it is, but sometimes it is. So hey, let's do that there. Planissima, assuming our manuscripts are correct at this point, and very often, you know, they vary on these matters. It looks like it's not like an accusative form at all. A bit of a case system slipped then. And then she gets it right again in pulchram at the end. And instantly, she's using the classical word pulchra there. We go on. In eo ergo loco, comunitor, when you get to that place, as those holy guides who were with us reminded us, deductores illi there, we haven't talked about the definite article in Romance. Of course, we know we haven't got it in classical Latin, or at least we're taught to believe it's not there. If you look at some Republican Latin authors, Sallust is a good example, very often, if he's writing a relative clause, he will have a form of ille beforehand. So exactly like this, deductores illi, and then your relative clause, qui nobiscum erant. And I suspect that's what's happening here. It's not grammaticalized, there's no formal definite article, but we're just heading in that direction. Quando there, meaning when. Okay, we do see this in classical Latin. More often we see cum, which of course she also uses, but quando's coming in because we don't see cum in the Romance languages meaning when, during classical Latin. There were, from that spot to the mountain of God, perhaps 4 miles in total. Habebat, interesting impersonal use of habeo. Think of Spanish, había, often. Per valle illa. Again, you can see the case system is simply not being observed, and you don't need it. Once you've got per there, you know what's going on. You don't need to have per valle illa. Perfectly clear what's happening. Which, as she said before, was ingen. So having made this mistake once, she repeats it in case we missed it first time round. Moving on. Oh, by the way, I meant to say here, if anyone wants to pop in at this point and shout up, I can't see my screen, so please talk over me if you want to. So the valley itself was very big, you can't get over this, lying under, and again, sub-monosyllabic preposition actually is quite heavily eroded in Romance. You tend not to get it. You know, things like French su is from sursus, Italian sotto, subtus in Latin. It was maybe 16 miles long. Milia passos, milia passuum would be classical Latin, thousands of steps. But here, two things have happened. Firstly, it's been sort of made a single word, and secondly, it's been assumed to the second declension. So passus is fourth declension in classical Latin, but it's second declension here. Ipsam ergo vallem nos traversare habebamus. Traversare, of course, again, it's not a classical word, we expect transire. And you've got the infinitive used with the verb to have. We had to cross the valley, or we were going to cross the valley. Is it future, or does it imply necessity? Well, it's on the cusp between the two. And notice again, you've got pronouns being used, demonstrative pronouns being used a little bit more than you might expect. And again, this looks rather towards what we find in the Romance languages again. And just moving swiftly on from here, one last thing I want to mention at the very end of this. She's talking about the landscape around Mount Sinai, where Moses is giving the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus, and we have the tribes of Israel camped out all around, and they start to worship this golden calf. And this is the valley in which the bulla was made. And this place is still shown today for a lapis grandis, a large stone. And the lapis word, incidentally, interesting one, because this is another one which largely disappears in Romance. We have Petra coming in, or sometimes forms from Saxon coming in too. It's in parasyllabic. In parasyllabics are always vulnerable. But here you simply have it occurring. But it's grandis, it's a big rock, not magnus, which is a word Egeria very, very seldom uses. And it stands fixed, fixus stat. And we talked earlier about stare and its use almost like the verb to be. And again, we're not quite there yet, but you can see we're certainly heading in that particular direction. So these are some of the things you can do if you start looking at these texts. And I realise this is an absolute whistle-stop tour. I think there's lots of fun to be had doing this. And as I say, if you're curious, I have this bibliography with plenty of links to good resources, and I would flag up that Adams book. Again, it's only been out for a few years, but even so, I think there's a paperback. It is sort of available there. So that really was where I what I wanted to talk about today, except I'm very happy to carry on talking, taking questions or whatever. And thank you all for your patience and your indulgence.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. That's fantastic. I'll just stop the recording.